Okay.
If I can introduce you.
Okay, Joanna.
Yes, please. Thank you. Perfect. Good evening. I'm Judy Hennessy, the Executive Director at the Harborview Training Center in Surrey, and I'm here to welcome everyone and to open this evening's event on behalf of the Accessibility Council, which has been created to consult and advise government on issues affecting individuals with disabilities. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michael Prince, the Lansdowne Chair in Social Policy at the University of Victoria. Dr. Prince will be speaking to us tonight about what is happening across the country in terms of public policies, programs, and services for individuals and families living with disabilities. He will identify innovations being tried in such areas as accessibility legislation, education, employment, income assistance, and financial savings. We are pleased that tonight's presentation is being live streamed on YouTube for those who cannot attend in person. And if you wish, you can submit questions to the email address princetalk@gov.pe.ca that may be asked to Dr. Prince here tonight. The presentation will remain on YouTube for those who would like to see it again or for those who missed the event. Now, a little about Dr. Prince. Dr. Prince took up his current position at the University of Victoria in 1987 as the inaugural Lansdowne Chair in Social Policy. He is acknowledged nationally and internationally as a leading authority on Canadian social policy and disability issues. He has been an associate professor at Carleton University, as well as a visiting scholar at the University of Edinburgh and Massey College at the University of Toronto. Dr. Prince received his PhD in politics from the University of Exeter in 1979. He is also a graduate of Carleton University and Queen's University. Dr. Prince has led several major Canadian research programs, including a 6-year Community University Research Alliance entitled Disabling Poverty, Enabling Citizenship. He has also advised federal and provincial government ministries, departments, and agencies in relation to social housing, disability income maintenance, employment programming, and electoral systems. Dr. Prince has been an active board member for a number of community health and service organizations. His academic work and community service has led to a number of prestigious awards, too many to list here, but copies of a full biography are available in the lobby. On behalf of the Accessibility Advisory Council, I would like to thank Dr. Prince for taking the time to visit us here in Prince Edward Island and to meet with us here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Prince.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to be here in Prince Edward Island again. This time special. My wife is with me on this visit, and it's been 36 years since we had the pleasure together of visiting PEI, and it's nice to be back. It's always nice to be back. The title of my talk this evening is Disability is a Bridge, Not an Island. First of all, just to be clear, I'm not against islands. I live on one myself on the West Coast. I'm from Victoria on Vancouver Island, and it's a metaphor, not a geographical critique of places where we might live. But it's the idea of disability is something that's about connections, and it should never be about isolation or segregation or marginalization. It's an opportunity to explore what unites us, what connects us as human beings. And in terms of services and policies, it's an opportunity to have a vision that promotes inclusion, access, and full citizenship. Preparing for tonight's remarks, I perhaps predictably went to Lucy Maud Montgomery for some inspirational quote, whether it's from Anne of Green Gables or some other of her vast body of writing. And I came up with one that I thought was apt for tonight. And I don't know whether it's because Thanksgiving just happened or Halloween is in the air, and I love these pumpkin displays I see in many homes throughout the city, over the last several days. But one of Ellen Montgomery's quotes was, she said, "I'm so glad I live in a world where there are Octobers." And I think it's an apt opportunity for me to be here this October with you to be talking about how to advance a vision of inclusion and participation of all people, of all abilities in our community. And I should also say that October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month that was announced by the Government of Canada. In my own province of British Columbia, October is Community Inclusion Month, sponsored by the Community Living Movement. So it's a delight to be here tonight, and let me start to talk about with you tonight a story about a vision of advancing the social or community inclusion of people with disabilities, and equally important, the economic participation of people with disabilities. And the first slide here talks about disability as a pervasive experience. Disability is both something that's personally embodied in us, but it's also socially embedded and experienced by us and others. The most recent national survey done on disability in Canada by Statistics Canada estimates about not quite 14% of the Canadian population over the age of 15 self-identifies as having some disability or impairment that impacts their ability to interact in a free and functioning way and fully in society today. That works out to not quite 4 million Canadians across the country. And here in Prince Edward Island, that same survey found that 16% of the population self-reported as having a disability. That's one of the higher rates in the country, and it's, I think, partly because of the age demographic and profile of the population here. If you're just interested, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick report slightly higher rates of disability in the country than here in PEI. But disability, besides a numbers game, is also something that touches almost all of us through our families, through relatives, through friends or neighbors. And I like to sometimes call the disability as a majority experience. It's not a minority or a small group of people that are, quote, afflicted or suffering from some condition. It's actually a majority experience of most of us. Disability touches so many people. That's one way that disability is a bridge. There's many ways of talking about, thinking about, labeling or diagnosing disability, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight talking in medical terms or psychiatric terms, but people with disabilities obviously are a diverse group, whether it's by different ages, gender, their social location, when the onset of their disability occurs in their life, whether they're born with a disability or they acquire one or more disabilities later in life. But we typically talk about physical and sensory impairments, and that's when Canadians are asked in public opinion polls what they think of when we talk about disability. The images that come to mind for most Canadians are either the parking sticker decal of that blue and white wheelchair user, or someone who's blind with either a guide dog and or a white cane. That's not all they think about, but that's often the main impression that is assumed or expressed by most Canadians. But we also have people with intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, Asperger's syndrome. The majority of Canadians with disabilities, though, perhaps present what are often called hidden or invisible disabilities. These are disabilities that are not obviously apparent to onlookers who may not know the person, and they're coming upon someone in a meeting or in a hallway or in a shopping mall or in a school or wherever else. It's not immediately apparent that the person has a disability of some kind. Brain injuries, head injuries, a lot of mental health conditions actually are not visibly apparent at first knowledge. Mental health is becoming increasingly a topic of discussion and awareness in our society, something that's been around for a long, long time, of course, but we're also learning more about things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, with relationship to the Afghanistan war that Canada participated in, and that's leaving a legacy of a new generation of veterans throughout the country, many of whom will not present trauma probably for another 5 or 10 or 15 years. Our experience from both World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, the Gulf Wars is that often the PTSD does not really appear for many, many years later. That sometimes leads to a struggle for being accepted or recognized as having an impairment that's due to a particular experience in one's life, and whether you'll be eligible for compensation or services or support from your workplace or from, in this case, serving in the Canadian Forces. There's another more recent discussion around episodic disabilities or fluctuating or cyclical disabilities. So many of our programs over the last 100 years have been based on a model that disabilities are visible, physical, permanent, and stable. And we know that most of life isn't like that, and neither are most disabilities. More people have episodic, fluctuating, cyclical conditions. Some have less severe, not so permanent, and not so visible. The challenge is, what's the impact on people's ability to participate in a fulsome way, in a real way in society? So not to focus so much on the impairment itself, but its effects in combination with the environment or society in which we live. There's some classic historical images, traditional perspectives of the disabled or people with disabilities going back centuries. And all of these still, in many ways, still circulate in some form in our societies, whether it's in Canada or United States or European countries. Like the classic, the pitiful beggar, the person who was deemed to be abnormal, different, defective, feeble-minded, people that we would lock away in asylums. The tragic figure, often through charity drives and campaigns on telethons, the deserving poor. The crippled child, the injured factory worker, which led to the creation of workers' compensation programs across Canada and the United States more than 100 years ago now. The wounded soldiers, whether that's from shell shock in the First World War, through other kinds of trauma and mental and physical disabilities through the Second World War and more recently. As I say, we now talk about that in terms of whether it's the Vietnam syndrome, the Gulf War syndrome, PTSD with respect to the Afghanistan conflict. There's another one that still circulates in Canada, unfortunately, which is to see disability as a financial burden, not just on the family, perhaps, and that's, if we recognize that there's a cost to families, if we respond to that in some meaningful way, thoughtful way, then maybe it's not such a bad image. But it's when people who want to immigrate to Canada, who may have a family member with a disability, more times than not, we will deny them that family admission into this country because we deem that person in the family with a disability as a burden on the social and health services of our provincial governments. And that's still a fairly negative image that persists today. We'll see what happens in the next couple of years with the federal government in terms of amending immigration laws, and disability groups are working hard to change that part of the immigration policy. But for each of these different figures, historically what's happened is that each of these images or figures of the disabled have prompted different programs. And so over 100 years, we've accumulated layers upon layers of silos and different agencies, different organizations, different rules, different eligibilities, systems for different groups. And then what it's done is it's made an incredibly complicated and complex and confusing system of programs. And a typical response is where Canadians may qualify for one program federally or provincially, feeling that they now then qualify for other programs and are told they're not. And we need to do a better job explaining to Canadians the rationale for programs and why there may be, for very good reasons, different eligibility requirements for different programs. Until the day that there may be one comprehensive program that covers everybody for everything, the reality in Canada will continue to be like every other country in the world, a complex system of programs where we need to do better on navigational and communication functions, but it still will have some complexity to it. Some more contemporary images of disability. And these have really started to emerge, I think, certainly from about the 1970s onwards. And a lot of this is the result of parents and families advocating for their children and their adult children, mothers and fathers, and working and forming support groups, disability organizations, working with other organizations in society to try to promote inclusion and opportunity for their family members. And so we start to see a different image being argued for and presented and claimed on behalf of people with disabilities and by people with disabilities. That they can be and they are active members of community. They are resilient and they can connect. The old thinking was that if you were deemed permanently disabled, you were permanently unemployable. And we often had programs with that sharp dichotomy that if you were employable, then you obviously couldn't be eligible for certain benefits or services. But we now know people who present fairly significant disabilities who are able and willing to work and just need the opportunities and the supports and the shifts in attitudes and thinking by many people to provide those real job opportunities. When the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was brought in 1982, people with disabilities, both physical and mental disabilities in Canada, were recognized. Canada was the first country in the world to entrench in its constitution a recognition of citizens with mental and physical disabilities as people deserving and qualified for basic equality rights. And that's led to the last 35 years or so of disability groups and other organizations claiming those equality rights, often through litigation, often through the courts, sometimes in a very expensive, time-consuming way, but nonetheless, disabled people, disabled organizations are equality seekers. In a provincial context, there are also people with human rights covered under provincial codes and rights of legislation. Starting in the late 1970s onwards, disability was added as a grounds of protection against discrimination on the basis of mental or physical disabilities. So again, some of these are fairly recent developments in our own country as it is around the world. But behind all that is this idea that people with disabilities have capacities, have abilities, have gifts, have contributions to make just like everyone else. And I work with groups with self-advocates, so this image of speaking up and speaking out for oneself and being able to assert one's political rights and democratic rights as citizens, again, like other fellow members of our community. But nonetheless, the last point on this slide talks about an image of disability still in terms of vulnerability. And that's still a too far common reality of many Canadians with disabilities, of being at risk of neglect, of violence, particularly women with disabilities being much more prone or in danger of neglect and abuse than other Canadians. And the recent change in legislation, or new legislation, I should say, for medical aid in dying, with the decriminalization of euthanasia or assisted suicide. Not all, but most disability groups in Canada saw that as a great danger and a threat, that as people already vulnerable, that this was a way perhaps of putting greater risk for people with disabilities. So the vulnerabilities still exist and there's work to do. Some people with disabilities are unwilling islands. I don't want to pretend that everyone's connected and fully integrated or included in society. Whether that's because of unmet needs, it might be because of where they live, the geography, the realities of rural or northern or remote communities. Indigenous people who live on reserves with disabilities are, again, facing tremendous challenges of services and integration into their own communities. Attitudinal barriers and prejudice and myths and misconceptions about disability still lead to people being ostracized or isolated or not really having genuine social interactions with other people in their communities. We have outdated services. We have approximately 10,000 younger people in this country in nursing homes who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, who for lack of other home care or community-based supports are being placed into nursing homes or other long-term care facilities and residing amongst people 20, 30, 40, 50 years older than they are. So in a way, there's lots of work to do. And the continued challenges of poverty as well. Now, what to do about that? Part of the ongoing shift in outlook and policy across the country is this philosophy of valuing diversity. We hear a lot about that from our Prime Minister and other politicians, but they also should add, and recognizing interdependency. And that's the community part, that's the bridge part, that's the connections. And we see that very well expressed in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's the first 21st century treaty. It was passed in 2006. It's one of the fastest treaties ever passed by the United Nations. Usually they take several years to get to one of these things. This was passed in record time. Canadian disability groups played a major role in the drafting of the convention along with some other countries, so we can be proud of that. And it was ratified by Canada in 2010. And that means all 10 provinces, as well as the Government of Canada, have signed on to and are subject to the obligations of the Articles of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I'll just want to read out one of the passages here on this particular slide. It's the last one. And this is from a document from the Government of Manitoba on disability issues, where they say, all persons are more or less able in a variety of ways that depend on their individuality and the circumstances in which they find themselves. So again, I think that's a wonderful acceptance or recognition of the interplay between the individual and the social, economic, cultural, political context in which they find themselves, and recognizing that everybody has a range of skills and attributes, and that disability and ability are inherent in the human condition and in any population. Associated with that is, in our modern thinking, is this political slogan that really came out of the international disability rights movement many years ago, and it's a favorite one of many people in the disability rights movement here in Canada, and that's the saying of nothing about us without us. And that's really saying if any time, not only just a government, but another public organization, it could be a school board, a hospital, a recreational center or facility, anytime you're thinking of developing a new rule or changing a program or introducing or reforming a service that's going to have an impact on us, you should first and foremost consult with us, involve us in a direct and meaningful way as members of a group that are being affected by that policy or change or service. And that, to me, is a way of really acknowledging that people bring experience is a form of knowledge that's worthwhile considering. The needs, the wants, the experiences, the goals, the hopes, the dreams, the frustrations, the challenges, the struggles that people bring are all valid knowledge, valid evidence that needs to be considered in the way we do decision making. It helps to make it more person-centered and more partnership-oriented. It's, in a way, a form of what could be called inclusive accountability of public decision makers to the citizens they serve and work for. It's also, this slogan is really a reaction of the historical experience of not being listened to, of being treated in a paternalistic, top-down way, of having your lives largely controlled by experts, whether medical, psychiatric, or other, and really struggling to feel empowered, not disempowered, included, not excluded. And here in PEI, in the case of the reform process underway now in terms of transforming the disability support program, this slogan refers to not only, I would say, consulting fully with clients or individuals and families that access the program, also, of course, the nonprofit organizations and other agencies that work in partnership with this program, but also the frontline staff and the other employees of the program and related programs. Their experiences, their voices, their concerns need to be involved in that. So this isn't just a narrow slogan about a client group, but it's about the partners and the other stakeholders that work in and around any kind of meaningful change. Another trend that's worth noting across Canada is this shift in focus from what might be called anti-discrimination legislation to new forms of laws that are more about proactive accessibility. And first of all, we know that even today in 2017, people with disabilities continue to confront and have to face both attitudinal barriers and environmental barriers. Attitudinal barriers, that basically means stereotypes, myths, prejudices, that as soon as you see someone perhaps with a disability, some very kind of deficit-oriented or negative or critical attitudes or assumptions come to mind versus seeing the person, seeing the capacities. The environmental barriers is a big fancy phrase for talking about whether it's the built environment, whether it's the way we design policies or services, the way we construct our communities. And that applies right across all of society. Well, we know those barriers still exist. We're making progress, but they still create, whether intended or unintended, conditions of exclusion and disadvantage. And we've had for the last 40 years now human rights laws across this country that really have focused on trying to say there are rights to being treated equally, and that if you feel you're being discriminated against on the basis of your physical or mental disability, there's a process, there's an avenue for redress. You can launch an individual complaint to a human rights tribunal or commission. The trouble with that is that's a case-by-case, ad hoc, reactive approach to dealing with these issues of barriers and discrimination. They can be expensive. The processes can seem very formal and intimidating to average citizens. And they really aren't getting at the root causes of a lot of the issues that we're trying to tackle. So what's happened is a recognition that we need to be more proactive, more systemic, and that's what these accessibility laws try to do, is to focus on preventing the creation of barriers in the first place and trying to then eliminate or reduce or alleviate the ones that currently exist. And they try to look at areas such as employment, education, the physical built environment, consumer goods and services in the retail or tourism or hospitality sectors, public transit systems and transportation, and the whole area of information and communications. And here in Canada, some of the Canadian developments, first of all, a welcome development by some human rights commissions is that they're now trying to do more active outreach or to be more proactive, rather than waiting for individual complaints to come in one at a time, is to look at the kinds of complaints that they've had over the years, to look for the patterns of concerns and barriers, and to say, can we go and meet with organizations before complaints happen, have a conversation with them where we can start to work in a positive, cooperative way to help tackle reducing the systemic barriers that are built into their policies, their practices, and in their structures. And the Canadian Human Rights Commission itself at the national level is looking at the area of mental health and wellness in the workplace, so employment and mental health. And they've really just started to do that in the last 2 years or so. And I'm hoping that that will, in partnership with their provincial counterparts, lead to some energy and new focus across the country on that issue. We also have seen in 3 provinces to date, governments passing or the legislatures passing accessibility laws specifically to address people with disabilities. Ontario was the first province to do this, and in 2005 passed a law which said that by 2025, that Ontario would be accessible for Ontarians with disabilities in 5 or 6 key sectors of life. And just pause on that. That's a 20-year time frame. That's acknowledging that we're going to be shifting attitudes. We're going to be getting companies to change the way they do practice of business. We're going to get teachers in schools to think about how curriculum can be taught differently, how public services, how tourism, how employment, transportation, how cities are built, how old buildings can be retrofitted. This is a major task. So picking a 20-year time frame, to me, some people think it's too short, some think it's too long, but we'll have to see. And on every 5 years, they have to review the act as they move forward. Manitoba followed suit in 2013, and then just this past spring, I think in the month of April, Nova Scotia passed a similar accessibility law in that province. At the national level, the Government of Canada is pledged to pass an accessibility law for the federal jurisdiction across the country sometime next year in 2018. We're anticipating to see a bill tabled in the House of Commons as early as next spring. And there's interest in other provinces. Certainly in British Columbia, where I live, we have a new government that came in this summer, and we're hopeful to have a conversation with them around advancing inclusion and participation by British Columbians with disabilities. And then, interesting thing about these policy developments is that in every single case, this phrase, "nothing about us without us," is being played out in practice. First of all, disability groups were very active in lobbying their provincial governments and the MLAs or the MPs to do this as the right thing to do. And once governments make a commitment to say, yes, we will develop a bill, we'll table it, we'll have hearings in the legislature, we'll go out to the communities, again, disability groups have been front and center in those conversations. And then thirdly, what's important is once the laws are passed, they set up, whether it's advisory design panels or an advisory council, where in some cases the majority of the members are people with disabilities. And other key stakeholders, whether they're people with design backgrounds, for universal design, architecture, engineering, whatever you have, the principle is that a significant presence is embedded in these processes for groups representing individuals and families with disabilities. That's walking the talk. That's enacting it and enshrining it in laws and practices across the country. So if there's a day where PEI begins this journey, I think the expectation will be, as it was in Nova Scotia, they had the groups from Manitoba come to Halifax. Groups from Toronto came to Halifax and worked in solidarity with their fellow organizations in the province of Nova Scotia to say, this is what you could do, and you should at least meet or beat what we have achieved in our province. We wish you all the best. And when governments came out with a draft bill in Nova Scotia that was less than the Manitoba Act, they were soundly and roundly criticized and said, you can do this. We have expectations. The mood is shifting, so there's some potential there for some exciting new developments. A lot of this is all informed by a really big phrase called full citizenship. This has been a slogan around in the disability community for a long time. It goes back to, I can think back to veterans who came back after whether it was World War I or World War II, who wanted to reintegrate back into civilian life and just wanted to be a full citizen. Or I think of the mothers in the 1950s who, when they had a child born with a developmental or an intellectual disability and were told they couldn't go to the local school, said why not, and fought hard for their children's rights to be included in the regular public education school system in their local school, not to be sent off to some separate facility or asylum. Here, the notion of full citizenship is much more than a passport for your country. It's about pathways to your communities. It's about being able to participate and be included in the community as a full member. And as this slide shows, this is a quote from a British academic, Simon Duffy, who does a lot of work with people with learning disabilities in the UK. And he said, for him, what he talks about full citizenship, he says it's really about two, and he calls them moral principles, because he talks a lot about the values. We're all different, and being different is a good thing, and we're all equal, with equal rights and equal value. So here you're getting this notion again of valuing diversity, but also asserting the universality of human dignity, respect, and I would say democracy as well. Now these are rather lofty ideals, and so let me take the next few minutes to try to make them more concrete, to show how they can relate to family life or to community life in our provinces. So let's look first of all at the notion of social inclusion. If we're committed to promoting community participation or social participation, what it means, well, often we talk about being in the community rather than being segregated or institutionalized. Again, particularly for people with intellectual, neurological, and developmental disabilities in this country, we built, starting in the 1850s and 60s, large institutions, grand structures that at some points housed 1,000, 2,000 people. In BC, we had our last large institution closed in the 1970s. I think we were the first province to achieve that goal. Ontario closed their last large institution about 10 years ago. It's a tough decision because it means laying off unionized, well-paying jobs in communities, but it takes political will. But what we learned was that just shutting down large institutions and saying people were being moved out now into community, they were no longer segregated, really wasn't really full social inclusion. Did they really have a public presence in the community was really a question we needed to ask. Did they have a full life in the community? Just getting deinstitutionalized or desegregated wasn't enough. So we started to talk about social inclusion of being not only in the community, but of the community. That you got a chance and an opportunity, like others, of being able to perform important social roles, whether those are family roles, educational, as classmates, in jobs, in leisure, sports, arts, culture, politics, whatever realms of life are meaningful in the mainstream of our communities, are people able to be active participants if they wish. So inclusion there is not only just being in the community, but being accepted and having opportunities for participation. But it also means having access to the opportunities and having resources to make those contributions possible, to be able to feel like you can grow and feel recognized. And those sources of resources aren't just governmental, but those are important. They're community resources, they're family resources, they're personal, they're voluntary sector or non-governmental, non-profit organizations. Now, sometimes I get nervous when governments praise the capacity and strength of the volunteer sector, because the groups I work with have been stretched for a long time. We have limits there, just as families have limits. I know governments have limits. We need to be honest with each other, different sectors, as to the relative roles, responsibilities, resources, and capacities. It's not just governments that face budget constraints. Certainly families do too. So does the voluntary or nonprofit sector. We need to look perhaps more to other groups that we haven't as much in Canada, the private sector and business, and organized labor, whether that's public sector or private sector unions, to look for their roles and leadership as well. Professional associations. We've done some campaigns in British Columbia on inclusion in schools, where we got some wonderful contributions in kind by some leading public relations and marketing firms that basically helped us with some social media campaigns that they said their time, if they were charging us as a client, would have been in the $300,000 to $400,000 range. And it was a contribution in kind. One of the owners had a son or daughter with a disability, got the issue. Now, we shouldn't have to rely on the kindness of that connection alone, but it's important to look for those strategic alliances where we tend not to. I think there are friends and allies in the business community, big and small, that we need to tap into far more effectively. But we need those resources to make social inclusion really a much bigger reality than today. Here's some of the pathways and changes that we see going on. The shifts from some of the more traditional methods. The column on the left-hand side talks about charity, segregated schooling, sheltered workshops, handicapped transport, segregated or special recreation programs, institutionalized facilities, and what some people might call passive welfare or safety net income support. These have by and large been the dominant approaches through the 19th century and through the 20th century for many groups with disabilities. Through the 20th century and into the 21st century, there's this aspiration and striving for new approaches, new practices. Again, not to say there's no role for charity, but to talk more about human rights and accessibility. Think about disability not as just a misfortune or a personal tragedy, but an issue of social justice. To look at inclusive education and the belief that all children and youth belong as much as possible in their local neighborhood public schools, with adequate supports for the teachers and for the community as well. And that under Education Acts, they have a right and are entitled to that inclusion and to those services and supports. Sheltered workshops or other forms of enclave employment, the aspiration towards what sometimes is called supported employment, which is a recognition that there will be a need for some supports. Some might be permanent, ongoing supports, a job coach, an interpreter, other forms of equipment, aids, or devices the workplace being reconfigured in terms of some accommodation, and inclusive employment, working with other islanders or other Canadians in other standard forms of employment rather than in segregated facilities. I won't go through them all, but you can see institutionalized facilities. Another challenge is to try to establish a full range of housing options. And we live in a time, certainly in my province, in British Columbia right now, of tremendous stress on affordable housing. The real estate market in Vancouver and in other parts of British Columbia are nothing less than madness in terms of the escalation of prices and inflation. Two income couples, both professionals, cannot afford to live in Vancouver. Husband and wife, doctor, lawyer, cannot afford to live in Vancouver as a young couple. The world has gone terribly wrong when that's the scenario. But for people who are far more vulnerable, far more under challenges, to find reasonable housing solutions without, and we find this in BC, without the risk of recreating segregated housing or smaller forms of institutions, because it's cheaper to build congregate separate housing or services. We need to think about the full range. And the last one on welfare, the idea of income support being something that can assist in active engagement with the person's participation, whether it's in volunteering, training, education, or employment, that there be incentives, not disincentives, for that active engagement, that they not fear losing the benefit by taking chances, by taking risks. And what we've seen in recent years in a lot of programs is what's called automatic reinstatement provisions, where you can leave the benefit and take up work, but let's say your condition worsens or flares back up again in 12 months or 6 months or 18 months or 24 months out, sometimes even as far as 3 years out, you are automatically entitled reinstatement. You do not have to go back through an application process and tell the program people, yes, I still have autism, yes, I still have lupus, yes, I still have cancer, yes, I still have this condition. But it's to give you that safety net reassurance. We're here if you need you. If you need us, we're here to back up. But we'd love to support you in taking that chance. We'll give you maybe some earnings exemptions, some training, some transition support. But we'll also let you know that if your life takes a turn again, we're here. We're here. And that's just something new in the last 10 years or so in Canada, to start to redesign old traditional income programs around that way of thinking. The other one that's tied with that is asset building, allowing people to be able to accumulate. The old model of welfare was you basically had to be, you couldn't have any assets before you could qualify, because if this was truly the last resort program of income support, we wanted you to be basically have to divest yourself of almost everything in your life. And if you lived with someone, we'd count their income too. And so if there was a man in the house who lived with the woman, we'd want to know why he wasn't supporting you, and all those rules. Tremendous surveillance, tremendous control. If you turn that around and say, if we allow people to accumulate assets or save assets, how do we work that in so that it enables them to participate, it improves their health and well-being, and it helps perhaps employability and participation in their families and their communities. And an example of that is the Registered Disability Savings Program, which allows families to create a savings strategy for their children who may qualify for the disability tax credit, and over a 50-year period, invest assets into that so that aged parents know there will be a financial security for their son or daughter with a severe disability, in addition to any other benefits they may have. It's a tremendously empowering way to say to families, here's a way that the government of Canada will help assist you. Again, Canada is the first country in the world to introduce that kind of program. And here in PEI, there's good take-up of it, but there's tremendous unrealized potential for people who qualify who have not yet applied for it. So I would say, if there's any other message tonight, remember those letters, RDSP, look it up, to talk about it, and see if there may be an opportunity there. But those are ways of trying to build new pathways of inclusion. Economic participation. Again, there's many benefits of work. I don't need to really rehearse these besides getting paid. But the dignity of getting a check for work, as opposed to having lived a life perhaps on income benefits or support, the self-esteem that comes from that. I mean, we live in a society where we often define ourselves by what we do, and that many of us who have the benefits and privileges and advantages to work, the self-esteem, the social connections we have, the sense of identity, the contributions we make, remind the productivity to the greater economy of the country or province. And so talking about economic participation in relationship to people with disabilities, particularly people with significant disabilities, we're really trying to change the conversation and shift the culture around expectations. Again, to move towards an image of people with disabilities as people with capacities who are potentially employable, and that there are many people with disabilities who are ready, willing, and able to work if the opportunities are there, the employers are there, the attitude shift, and certain services are made available. And that, some of the principles here, employment first is really to say that paid work is the preferred outcome for a lot of people, disabled or not. And that for youth with disabilities, that while they're in school, we ought to be thinking about how to provide work terms or co-op placements or other kinds of job experiences. And my dream is that no student should graduate from high school in Canada anywhere without having had the opportunity for 1 or 2 work experience placements. Now, for some people, that's kind of a given, but for a lot of young Canadians, it's not. And in fact, not only is it not, it's assumed that it's not. And it's assumed it's okay that it's not an opportunity. Where a guidance counselor doesn't think, oh, he or she, that student, oh, they have a disability, won't think about it for them. They won't initiate the conversations with parents. They won't dare to dream what the possibilities are. We need to shift that culture too. Reasonable accommodation, fine. Real work for real pay is another slogan of the disability movement. Not be paid below the minimum wage, not be paid some training supplement or volunteer honorarium, but to actually be paid the minimum wage of the province and to be afforded the same employment standard protections and rights and obligations as anyone else who would be participating in the economy of that province. And if they do work of equal value, pay them equivalency. These are, again, articles instated in the UN Convention, but these are also laws across the country that we currently have. But we do have at least 3 provinces in Canada that still allow people with disabilities to be paid less than the minimum wage of that province, as if that's okay. The next slide, I tried to avoid doing charts with lots of numbers, but I couldn't escape one here. Here I just wanted to talk about in terms of economic participation, the patterns of people with disabilities and people without disabilities. This is for Prince Edward Island. This is a survey that's about 5 or 6 years old now, but it looks at working age people from ages 15 to 64 who either declared with a disability or without. And you can see that those who without disability, 43.6% work full-time, full year. What we used to call standard employment in Canada, or the gold standard. So less than half of Canadians without disabilities who are in the labor force work full-time, full year. People with disabilities, 28.6%. But let me take your eye down to the bottom corner one, who is not in the labor force. People with disabilities, 34%. These are people who've never been in the labor force or are currently counted as unemployed or have stopped looking for work. Now, those numbers don't add up to 100. I've left out some other categories, which I won't explain right now. But what I wanted to show was both the opportunity or challenge to work on that 34%, but also to acknowledge that there's already some success here in terms of people participating. People with disabilities are employed in the labor force. Many might have mild or fairly moderate impairments or conditions, but some have severe conditions as well. But overall, people with disabilities in Canada, here in PEI included, are more likely to be unemployed and are not even in the labor force compared to other Canadians. What to do about it? Now, this requires, I think, a cross-government and an intergovernmental strategy, both federal government and provincial governments. It goes well beyond one particular program or one particular ministry or government department. Here in PEI, dare I say, it might require a social policy strategy or framework, or a poverty reduction strategy, or both. But the top box, you're looking at improving what we might call the supply of the labor, or what are the attributes and characteristics of people who we want to encourage to participate in the labor force. So we try to enhance their life skills, their social skills, education, so through student loan and grant programs, inclusive education, co-op opportunities while people are attending high school, obviously training and retraining. Here we're trying to improve the quality of the potential worker and provide them with some pre-vocational supports. Then we have to also look at the demand side, which is the bottom right corner. Wage subsidies are for targeted groups, including people with disabilities. There may be internships, summer programs for students with disabilities, or other programs. Tax incentives, either federally or provincially, or both, to employers to make their workplaces more accommodating, more inclusive for people with a range of disabilities or needs. Trying to encourage the creation of social enterprises or cooperatives, self-employment initiatives as well. But these are all policy tools trying to increase the demand to grow the economy, that there are more jobs out there. And then the other box is the link between the people we're investing in and the economy where we're trying to create jobs is often the employment service agencies and the counseling services and the job placement vocational agencies. And again, in the world of disability, this is a complex, bizarre world. It's a sector that is underdeveloped. It needs capacity building. We need to improve the skills and information networking to improve how we can match people to jobs. And that's for all Canadians, but specifically for Canadians facing major barriers like Canadians with disabilities. We need to how to better match the job seekers with prospective employers, both to help the job seeker, but often employers will say, yeah, I'd like to maybe hire some people with disabilities, but I don't know where to go to, or where to turn. And when they often go to employment service agencies or placement agencies, they're not much more help either. They may contact a local disability service group or a service club. We need to be smarter about how to facilitate those connections. Governments occasionally will have programs where they'll have life skill courses, training programs, but they don't connect the other boxes. We need to have a continual flow of paying attention to the person, the workplace, but also often the linking agencies that help facilitate that employment experience and opportunity. And again, if we start doing it in high school, we'll start to shift cultures and attitudes and expectations as to what's possible, and raise the level of knowledge among employers as well. Full citizenship of islanders with disabilities. This is, I think, part of the vision that's informing some of the discussions going on right now in PEI around improving and transforming various disability services and supports. Again, a big idea. Here I just want to talk about, notice the ambition here, the scope of when we talk about full citizenship, particularly for people with disabilities. It involves promoting and protecting the inherent dignity and the autonomy of all persons, of everybody having the opportunity to equally enjoy all human rights, not just a few easy ones, and fundamental freedoms by all persons across disabilities, and the extensive and effective participation of people with disabilities and other Canadians in all segments of community life that they wish to participate in. Notice the ambition there. Notice the high standards. But that's the aspirations. What it might mean more specifically, if someone says, well, those are all fine and dandy big words, but what might it look like? Actually, it's kind of familiar. Full citizenship means being able to attend school with your neighbors. It means being able to get around in your community. How accessible is it, whether it's through transportation or the physical environment of sidewalks and roads and so forth. It's about having a summer job when you're a young person. Being able to play sports or games, attend concerts, go to movies, making big decisions in your life and those little decisions. Big ones like where to live, having the opportunity to decide where to live and with whom. This is still a major decision for a lot of people with significant disabilities, still living at home with parents, aging parents, middle-aged young sons and daughters. There'll be an issue there, a crisis perhaps looming for Canada to address that one. Being able to earn money. And the responsibility of trying to keep the job and following a schedule. Being able to volunteer, and full citizenship is also about taking responsibility for one's actions. And that includes being able to take risks and make mistakes and being held accountable for those mistakes. And that's a biggie and a tough one, often in disability discussions, is moving off a history of protection and perhaps segregated programs and institutional facilities to something more open and out, but assuring parents and reassuring others that we have an obligation to provide best supports and services, but to recognize that full citizenship is about making mistakes. It is about taking risks. It is about sometimes having to take responsibility for those actions that may be intended or otherwise. But that one is around issues around supported decision-making as well, that recognizing people's capacities and the potential and the limits of those capacities, and where possible, where there needs to be advocates, interpreters, powers of attorney, and so forth, guardianship. There's conversations we continue to need to have around how to support the ability of being autonomous, but also in a responsible way. And then being able to vote in elections and maybe even run for election. And again, a more recent trend in the last generation is seeing more people with disabilities getting elected into public office. It's still a minority. They're still underrepresented in public office, people with disabilities. Or even to be, I belong to an organization where at the AGM, I'm always delighted to see the number of self-advocates who run for office, and they give their campaign speeches, and I see them lobbying in the hallway. They turn into little politicians like everybody else. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but it's full citizenship in another form. They're playing the roles they see played by others in our society. Maybe we should think about how those roles are played before we want more people to play them, but it's saying, I want to be an employer, I want to be a politician, or I want to be a lobbyist, I want to be an activist, I want to get engaged in my community too. So that's full citizenship. So finally, just to wrap up, so this vision of advancing social inclusion and economic participation, all with the intent of getting to this aspiration of full citizenship. It's a powerful idea. It's a bold idea. It's one that's always going to be elusive to us, but it's one that's continually, many of us take it for granted, and we cannot deny that elusive appeal, that lure of full citizenship to others. Just because it's tough and we may never fully achieve it, it's what is there to motivate us. It's a 24/7 affair. And by that I mean it never sleeps, full citizenship. It never stops. We need to continue to work on it, and we need a public infrastructure of attitudes and services and support and goodwill to advance that inclusion and participation. And just like disability as an idea or as an experience or as a phenomenon, the concepts of inclusion and participation, they too are ideas that continue to evolve and develop. What we might think of as inclusion today is not what people maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago would have called inclusion. There'd be elements of it, but it continues to evolve. Different groups emerge calling for human rights in Canada. Different groups claiming that have been minorities, have been silenced. This is an ongoing evolution of our society. What we think of as well-being. We face challenges of what does employment mean in a world where there's so much more precarious employment, the decline of the 9-to-5 job, the internet economy, the knowledge economy, the virtual, the sharing economy of Uber and Airbnb. The world is changing constantly, but we pursue full citizenship in that context that's constantly shifting. But we need to keep an eye on dignity, opportunity, access, and inclusion. So it does require some courage. It requires conviction because we can't stop it. and creativity, because the world out there is always challenging us. The future's never quite what we think it's going to be. It never quite behaves according to our plans. But as I say, after all, what we're doing is a very noble task, I think, of building bridges of accessibility and inclusion. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.
So thank you very much, Dr. Prince, for a very inspiring conversation. For those who are at home and would like to ask questions, you can email us at princetalk@gov.pe.ca. And if anybody in the audience has a question, I can bring you the mic so people at home as well as in the audience can hear. And Dr. Prince will be glad to respond to you. Questions? Okay, so I'm going to start then.
Sure.
So one of the things that you talked just a little bit about tonight was the economics of other ways to do business. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've been hearing about are parents receive funding to support children, maybe in respite in particular, but there's not always enough out there for them to purchase. So what are other ways that the need can be met?
Oh, maybe I'll just stand here. I was going to walk a bit, but I can. One of the ways to answer that quickly is in my own community of Victoria in BC, we're seeing what some people are calling family-based governance arrangements. They might be a version of what some people call micro boards, which we can talk about as well, but it's where 5 or 6 sets of parents with children who maybe, often it's where I've seen this happen is where children are aging out into adulthood. So it's that difficult transition of moving off services that were available to your son or daughter while they were a minor or a child or youth, and they're now becoming adults. And this is classic silos, certain government programs say, goodbye, thank you, you've aged out, good luck. And you're going to go over there now to that ministry or that ministry, and you need to reapply or get reassessed and so forth. And we do that not very well in a lot of parts of the country, but this one group of parents were having that common challenging experience with their sons and daughters, and they decided to work together because they were sort of sharing and bitching and about the issues. And they decided, let's pool our resources. These were parents who had known each other for a number of years, so the trust was there, the connections were there, and they pooled their resources and then started to make kind of basically individualized funding decisions. So there was enough discretionary pool of money to sort of say who needs what when. They incorporated themselves, and they worked with our organization called Community Living BC, which is our crown organization that provides the funding. And it has sustained itself now for about 6 or 7 years. So now their sons and daughters many of them are in their mid-20s. Some of them are going off into university or other training or college opportunities. Some are working. So there's a mix of experiences. But from the parents' point of view, it's been incredibly empowering to be able to pool resources and to create opportunities and flexibility in the way they can choose and hire perhaps staff and interview people. Because when we talk about giving people the money to make decisions, we're also putting a lot of burden on parents to become suddenly contract managers, employers, interviewers. They start to realize they've got employment responsibilities under provincial labor laws for the people they've hired. And it's like, yikes, I just wanted some money to help my kid. Now you're turning me into a corporation or something. And so the solidarity of mutual support. So what in the old days might have been self-help groups and peer groups, some of those are in a way kind of being reinvented in terms of very purposeful small communities of parents networking and pooling resources that way. The version of a micro board is often focused on one particular family and then creating a circle of, a formal circle of support. So it's like taking that idea of a micro board, but, merging 4 or 5 or 6 of those into a collective or a cooperative. There's other more informal ones as well, like Circle of Supports. There's different language across the country. I'm not sure what the language might be here on the island, but it's that idea of trying to, in small pockets of collective care. It can be helpful in rural areas and northern communities where, you know, some of the public services just aren't there in the same way as in larger cities or urban areas. So it's an idea that I think, again, provincial governments should be looking at and talking to parents about, is this something we should help people at least know is an option? And is there a way, even just in a soft way through information and conferences, explore it? Maybe not push it or promote it hard, but just say, you know, because we're not, you know, we're early days on these experiences. There's clearly some risks with them, but there seems to be some real benefits. They're very intentional and grassroots up. They're a bottom-up phenomenon. And they're a lot of work, but it's a whole lot of work. So it's, but it's that the attractiveness of it is feeling we're not alone. There's like-minded people with us, and that we're sharing and pooling resources that, you know, the sum is greater than the parts, and that can be tremendously, I think, positive. So I would hope that through various family institutes and family groups that kind of model is probably playing out in other ways too that I'm not aware of, to be honest. But those are some examples of that, I think, that really are helpful.
Thank you. We have a question from the floor.
Hello, my name is Helen Smith McPhail, and I'm a parent of a child with a disability, and we've gone through the public school system and have had a very inclusive education system for my son, and we are at the end of that road. He is now 20, he'll be 21 at Christmas time, so he's exiting the school system, and we're looking at future options. And I just want to explain to you some of the real gaps, as was alluded to in funding, that we are facing. So he is at the top end of the disability support program, so he's getting the maximum amount of funding now. And we are looking at a day program for him for the future, where he will go, and that is looking at, it's going to cost us, the family, anywhere between $1,000 or $2,000 a month is what we are looking at putting out of our own pocket, probably closer to the $2,000 range is what we're looking at doing. So, and so identifying some of the gaps, and I really appreciate some of the ideas that you have here, which are wonderful, but the disability support program here on PEI assesses each individual individually, and so the idea of pooling our resources with other families is not something that is really available to us, because he's assessed at the top end, and other families are as well, and there really isn't any extra pool of money there. And so while I do appreciate, and I do know some families who have had some success with that model here on Prince Edward Island, and it's worked very well for them, it depends on where you're assessed in the assessment. And if you are at the high end of that, then it's not, there's not enough funding. It's just, there's a gap there, a gap in funding. And when we talk about the rights of people to have a valid day job or a day program of some sort and receiving that support, the support has to be there financially as well as community minded. So I appreciate what you're saying. However, until some of the financial supports are in place, it's the pooling of resources is not going to happen because there's no resources to pool. It's all being used for the care of the child. So that's one thing I want to point out. The other thing is that you alluded there to the idea of parents becoming, you know, the manager of their child's care, and that is something that I want to point out that is very, very difficult. I'm not an economist at all. I'm a teacher, so I don't run payroll. I don't do that sort of stuff. I have had to run payroll in the past for my son because we did have to hire somebody at one point in time. And, you know, that's a task that I think is monumental to put on families. The whole idea of trying to, you know, take those roles on as a manager of their child's care and welfare becomes huge, really huge. And then the third thing that you address that I would like to address as well is the lack of, so we're very fortunate here on Prince Edward Island. The inclusive education system is one that we have participated in all the way through. Nicholas has friends at school. He has people that come up to me in the community and say, hey, you're Nick's mom, and tell Nick I said hi. And so, you know, that whole idea, it's coming. However, he is 20, and you are right, the 20-year long range look at this is that inclusive education has worked well in our community for the last 20 years, with a few bumps along the way. Now, I'm not going to, there's been a few bumps, but nothing too serious. But now we're at the end of that and embarking on this next part of his life. And, you know, as a parent, it is very, very concerning to know that there's a gap there that has to be filled in somehow. And I hate to say it, but I think the biggest gap is in the funding.
Yeah.
The funding gap that is there is huge. And, you know, the idea, now I know, you know, the idea of including, so in the disability support program supports his disability and what he needs for his disability. However, the day program, if we're looking at social inclusion should be excluded from that funding model and put in its own pool as here's a program that needs to happen in order for us to have a successful citizenship, full citizenship of these citizens. It should be separate from the disability support program so that the disability support program supports his disability, but yet the inclusive model is continued through the system.
Yeah.
And right now, those two systems, there's not a separation there, and that is a big gap for us, large gap in funding, big time. Anyway, thank you. I may have more later, but that's it for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. You know, on the first issue around the financial challenges, I think I didn't talk about it here, and I have no quick, easy answer for you in the short term. There's a lot of work been going on recently in the last few years and continuing on trying to convince our parliamentarians in Ottawa and the Government of Canada and political parties at the national level that we need a program that's equivalent to the Old Age Security Guaranteed Income Supplement. We provide a guaranteed annual income for seniors in this country, and a number of us have been working on for several years now the idea of a basic income for Canadians with severe or significant disabilities. So certainly your son Nick would be eligible for that. One proposal is that people who would qualify for the DTC, the disability tax credit, that would be one suggestion of what an eligibility, and that it would be a national income program, indexed like OAS, Old Age Security, GIS is, and then it be a livable, so it would be at the range of $16,000, $17,000, $18,000 a year, non-taxable. Negotiations would have to be taken place with the provinces to ensure they don't offset or claw that back in the way it interacts with other benefits. So this is a bold vision, but it's to say we now have a Canada Child Benefit that the Trudeau government brought in last year. We've had old age security since 1952, so it's 65 years old this year. So we've done it for children, we've done it for seniors. There's another group that is people with severe disabilities where, quite frankly, the labor force opportunities and the ability to earn a livable income are very challenging, to be honest, despite the inclusive education opportunities and that the additional costs families have to bear and have borne for many years needs to be acknowledged somehow in a national income security program. And I think Canadians would accept that. We just need to get politicians. The new leader of the NDP has endorsed that proposal. I was delighted to see that. I'm not a member of any political party, but I work with them all or against them all, depending on the occasion. But I believe in that vision as a policy reform. So because it should be a national program. We should not expect particularly small provinces with limited resources to provide a benefit that should be, regardless of where you live in this country, that support should be there. That should be a national responsibility, as we've done with children and seniors. And so I would say, you know, we have continued advocacy on that. So if you ever get a chance to talk to your local member of parliament, he's a Liberal, obviously, so, you know, make that pitch. Because I find when I talk with politicians, Disability is often a nonpartisan issue. I've worked with Bloc Québécois, Péquiste, Reform, Alliance, Liberals, NDP, Conservatives, Social Credit, whatever you want to call it. And because in all of their parties, there are parents who get this because of their own family circumstances. And you just need to touch their hearts and say, you know, this isn't about politics. This isn't about your party or their party. This is the right thing to do for Canadians. This is the best of our values. This is about decency and equality and fairness. And I know we've worked, I can send you through, you know, information on this if you wish, but to me that's the continued work we need to do. In the short term, you're quite right. We need to look at how, in the interim, how through either refundable tax credits or other ways that money comes back to you to reimburse you for additional costs, out-of-pocket expenses for you. And that, again, should probably be a federal program, a federal refundable tax credit. That might be a more short-term viable option that we might achieve from the Government of Canada. The longer term is the big ask for a guaranteed annual income for Canadians with severe disabilities or significant disabilities. Because that would be a program, too, that would cost $6, $7, $8 billion a year, maybe a bit more. But that's not a big ask from in the overall scheme of things. From where I sit, when we talk about, I mean, old age security GIS is now a $50 billion a year program. And politicians continue to enrich it because they see votes in programs for seniors. They fall over each other, still promising more. And let's face it, there's still some poverty among seniors, but the poverty rate among seniors, interestingly, statistics show that if Canadians with disabilities live long enough and get to 65, the poverty rate among Canadians with disabilities disappears. Well, the difference between people with and without disabilities virtually disappears at age 65 in Canada. And the reason is because if you get to 65 and you qualify for old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, in most provinces, you suddenly see a lift in your income because you haven't worked your whole life. You've probably lived on income assistance. And in most provinces, income assistance is way below old age security and guaranteed income supplement. So we have this bizarre phenomenon that people from age 65 on with disabilities suddenly start to get a little easier life financially. But it's like we make you wait that long, which is, I think, ridiculous. Anyways, I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. I'm glad to hear about your experiences on inclusive education and on the friends and the social connection. That's nice to hear, you know, because that's not been a common experience for a lot of people. On the family burden one, you're right. We have to be careful what we, you know, one of the reasons in my own province individualized funding has not taken off more is families who have taken it up realize the burden. And so they tell other parents, you know, we thought this was going to be great. We're going to have more flexibility, but we're not so sure. We need some help on being empowered to manage the funds. And again, there may be more creative ways, whether it's private sector, nonprofits, government in partnership with you. You know, there has to be some apps. You know, we live in the world of apps now. Apps and other programs to help manage or pooling of ideas and technologies for assisting people having to take on, like a small business, all those responsibilities on top of everything else. And say, hey, aren't you empowered now? Don't you feel better? It's frightening, isn't it? It's daunting. And so, again, I'm not saying government should hold on to it all too either, but we need to figure out a happy medium here rather than just seeing it as offloading or extra burdens to you on the top of everything you've got. So I hear it. I'm glad other people may hear this message tonight, that you've raised those questions, so thank you.
Dr. Prince, excuse me. We have a couple of questions that came in through the Prince Talk at gov.pe.ca. First one is from Bridget Cairns. Actually, both are from Bridget, who you would have met yesterday. She's with Inclusion PEI and Association for Community Living.
Oh, right, okay.
And her first question is, in Prince Edward Island, we exempt the RDSP up to the low income levels. Is this similar in other provinces and territories?
Yes, so the Registered Disability Savings Program, people being able to accumulate assets in a tax-sheltered savings program, there isn't this, again, this had to be negotiated at the time when RDSP was brought in 10 or 11 years ago now. The government of Canada had to negotiate and contract with every province. And it took about 2 years to get all the provinces on side, but they all did eventually say, we will not claw back RDSP assets. Now again, we need constant vigilance on this, and the best vigilance is an informed, active citizenry. But the more Canadians who set these up, the more family members who help contribute to an RDSP, the more our voices are stronger and our political clout or potential is, and that politicians will avoid touching this because of the political consequences. I hate to sound political, but that's, the good news is the number, there's now well over 100,000 RDSP accounts created across the country, but the potential is it could be 3, 4, 5 times that many. We could have a huge, in PEI, I think about 33% of the families eligible to set up RDSPs have set them up. So there's, for every one, there's at least 2 other families out there on the island that could be setting up an RDSP tomorrow and, you know, starting to create a financial strategy of savings for their son or daughter over the long term. So, you know, that's one thing the PEI government could do in concert with nonprofits and the banking community and others, is just raising that awareness. In BC, we have an RDSP awareness month. You know, we got the government of the province to agree to that. They see it as a benefit because they figure if families are saving more, it takes a little pressure off them and some of their budgets. So they see, well, sure, why not? We'll create an awareness month. We'll talk to the banks and the other financial institutions, and they've partnered now with some foundation. They've discovered in our own province that as a messenger, the government department was seen with some, shall I say, suspicion. And our government said, you set up an RDSP account, we'll give you $150 on top of what the government of Canada gives you. We'll sweeten it with another $150. People said, oh, that sounds too good to be true, and it's from the government. Oh, I don't know. So what they did was they delegated it to the Vancouver Foundation, along with a group called Disability Alliance BC and an Indigenous group, so we could start to look at people living on reserve, which are really challenging communities just to address, and say, okay, you 3 organizations work together, we'll give you the pot of money, you go talk to people. And suddenly the take-up rate went up because the messenger changed. The message was the same, but it was the people talking about it were seen as trusted community-based partners, not an official government. It's a sad message, maybe. I mean, no offense to public services, but it's that sense of, I don't know who to really trust or I want to talk to, or talk about my bank account or my taxes, or this is very intimate, personal stuff. But if it's a nonprofit and a foundation that I know, or another group, and our take-up rate in BC is taken off. So sometimes it's getting them to take setting it up in the first place, but then also reassuring them that it's not going to have a negative impact on their eligibilities or some of their benefits, and you know, that's another conversation. So we've got a ways to go on that. It's still a new program. It's less than 10 years old, and it's again one of these things we just need to get people to become aware of and navigate around. So.
Sure. Another question from Bridget. Her question is, with employment being a top priority for the federal government, are there models on workshop transformation or inclusive employment, real work for real pay, that PEI should be considering?
Oh, there's probably good models here on the island that I'm not aware of. I'm sure there are. You know, we face this challenge in BC of trying to transition off. I know in Ontario there's a big debate in the United States. There's been a very heated debate around moving off sheltered workshops to more inclusive workplaces. The model that's being talked about a lot now are either social enterprises of encouraging the formation of a blend of a business model and a nonprofit. Some are created by people with disabilities themselves, and so there's a form of self-employment there. Some are co-ops. Some are, you know, the Sobeys of the world, the large grocery stores and the Home Depots and the hardwares, and the, you know, you find corporate champions who will take up this as part of their diversity plans and strategies. It's part of their corporate social responsibility. But also, TD Bank, they figured out that this was just good business practices. As a good bank, they said, yeah, it might make us feel good, but it helps our bottom line. They looked at the percentage of Canadians with disabilities and said, oh, it's 13 or 14%. Would we want our competitors to get that 14%? Or would we like us to get that for it? We'd rather be there ahead of the Bank of Montreal or Royal Bank. So again, from good old market forces, you start to appeal, you get some corporate champions there. But again, it might be part-time work, it might be shift work. It depends on the sectors and the nature of the economies in each province or each region. But some of it's the phenomenon of Rotary clubs or Chamber of Commerce, other business groups are tremendous allies here to get the word out. Another one is the notion of job carving, where you go to a company and they say, well, we don't have any new jobs, but you watch the work that's being done, particularly by high-priced professionals, and say, I see you're doing your own Xeroxing, or you're doing your own sort of clerical work. Is that the most efficient use of your time? No. Well, if we carved out the time that you all spend on that task, we could create a new job for someone who did that for all of you. That would probably free you up to do what you're trained to do as a professional and support the organization. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That's job carving, finding work from finding and appealing to their own professionalism and their own sense of efficiency and effectiveness. And again, not saying it's charity, you're actually appealing to helping that organization be more effective in its functioning. Job coaching is another one, mentoring, of course. But we're still all learning the notion of supportive employment. And this is the big one for the federal government. With the new Accessibility Act that they will probably pass next year, I hope by next fall, there's going to be a priority given to employment under federal jurisdiction. So I think we'll see a renewed attention to new money come into labor market agreements to the provinces, some have formed for Canadians with disabilities. So some of that should probably be around social innovation and new ways of creating inclusive employment opportunities for young people. I think there's going to be a focus on youth and disability to kind of say, how do we work on the next generation who have had some inclusive education experiences that maybe prior generations didn't have, and how do we reinforce that and continue to build on, reward that with our opportunities of work of some kind, so that the next generation see that and we continue to build on that. If we lose the momentum, we're going to slip back again. So I think that the federal government's hearing that message, and I think we'll see in the next year or so some new emphasis there. There's also the federal poverty reduction plan that's been promised. I'm not sure when it's going to come, whether we'll see anything in the next federal budget next February, March. But if we don't, again, you're going to hear some pushback from a lot of groups saying, you've almost been in government 2.5, 3 years now. You promised a federal poverty reduction plan. Where is it? Our community needs to be, a prominent part of that discussion and strategy. Let's get going. And some of that's got to be around income support. And I think this idea of the basic income should be part of that conversation. Now, again, that might be long-term, like if that'd be for maybe the next government after this one in terms of an election, but we keep working and pushing. But employment, I think, will be one where we'll see more efforts. Because it always bothers me when I hear employers say, I've got jobs that I can't fill because I can't find skilled people. I'm thinking, there's hundreds of thousands of Canadians with disabilities, many of whom got post-secondary degrees, most who have high school. Let's figure this out. We've got people living amongst us who want to work, are ready to work. We need to somehow be more focused and strategic on that, making that happen. So, but we're trying to figure out ways of reducing the barriers, particularly for people with very significant impairments. So that requires ongoing investment on job support, job coaching, and modification. A lot of accommodation can be one-time, low cost for people with moderate and mild disabilities, but certainly for people with severe, we need to be honest to say this will require an ongoing investment. And I think, again, the Government of Canada could help employers with various kinds of tax credits or financial incentives. We let them write off for equipment and other sorts of investments. We need to help them invest in making more inclusive workplaces for Canadians with disabilities. So again, it's just trying to be more creative, more courageous and bold in the way we think about how to create employment and how to sustain it. And not shy away from the challenges, acknowledge them and say, how are we going to make this happen? It's going to be tough, but if we're going to go for rights and full citizenship, it's not for free. The history of citizenship shows there were revolutions, struggles, battles for all these rights. These things didn't come free and easy on a tray. And we need that struggle, inevitably will continue, that we have to do. Thank you, Bridget, for the questions.
Are there other questions from the floor? Vernon, you're good too.
Once again, Helen Smith McPhail here, and I want to go back to what you had commented about governments talking about the volunteer sector and saying that they have a strong presence and how fortunate they are. The other sector that is often overtaxed, especially on long-term care, and this goes into housing as well, and long-term care and long-term disability care, is the parent population. So I'm always amazed that, we have wonderful advancements in medicine now that allows us to have children survive very difficult births and very difficult situations when they're young and move into the community and become active, members, maybe not active, but members, depending on their families. That depends on how active they are. We've tried to have he's one of 4 children, so I have 3 other children. And so we've done all kinds of things as a family to keep him in our community and active in our community. And he's well recognized and that sort of thing, Nicholas is. But I guess my concern as a parent is that oftentimes I feel like I have taken on the burden of his care, his personal care. My husband and I do all of his personal care with no outside assistance at all. No one has ever connected us with a home care worker. As far as I know, that's not something that we can access on Prince Edward Island. So we do essentially nursing level care. Neither of us is trained as a nurse in our house for my son. And so we're fortunate that our house is accessible, and we do have some equipment in our house that has been provided through the Disability Support Program. However, the ongoing burden of that care is huge, and then the look down the road in the future at what is available for housing for him is, I would say, non-existent at this point in time. Like, I'm looking at having to invent. I don't know where. If we got sick tomorrow, I don't know where he would go. I really don't. Yeah. I think he would probably land at the hospital, and then hopefully he might get into the under 60 unit at the Prince Edward home. I mean, he's 20, Yeah. So, these are some of the options that we're looking at. He's been assessed through a couple of different organizations through the provincial organization. Provincial assessment has been done, and he's beyond community care facility care, and he's been assessed at another facility that provides housing for people, and he's been assessed as beyond their care as well. Mm-hmm. So, when you start looking around at what's out there for housing, and you did say that you did note that there are 10,000 people living in nursing homes who shouldn't be living in nursing homes. So that would be another large gap in our system presently. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas on how to fill that gap, because that's a very difficult gap to fill. And so just to carry on with this a little bit, so he's 20, and in an inclusive society, so he's gone through the school system. My girls are now, I have a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 10-year-old. So those 3 children are also moving through the system. At some point in time, if we are going to have a system that is treating these people as full citizens, then he should not have to live at home he should be able to go, unless he boomerangs back like some of the kids do. You know, he really should be able to go out and experience that going away from home. And I don't, at this point in time, foresee how he is going to have that experience. And he should have that experience. Really.
I was really good questions. I'll talk about housing in general. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC. I was at a conference last year that was co-sponsored with the Canadian Association for Community Living. And we had invited up from the United States some housing experts that have looked at how to create more affordable, permanent affordable housing and low-cost or nonprofit housing in the United States. Some of it targeted for Americans with disabilities. And part of the conversation involved that a lot of, not a lot, in the community living movement, given our history of having residential facilities and community centers and having that, a lot of the provincial associations own land. That we might be short on cash, but we have land assets. And in certain cities in Canada, some community living and other disability groups have very valuable pieces of real estate. But they don't have the money to do anything with them. So it's how to find partners. And again, in the United States, there's been some interesting financing vehicles brought in by the US federal tax code to encourage developers, builders, and nonprofits to partner so that if a nonprofit brings the land, how they get investments in together. I don't remember all the details right now, but it's, again, trying to think very creatively and say, how do we create new housing and build more housing in a way, whether it's group homes, mixed housing use, mixed income use, because the developer will be looking for some return on investment. But if part of it is the government giving that developer tax credits and write-offs that incentivizes or encourages them to participate, and if the nonprofit brings the land, then there's real opportunities to see some creative construction of residential housing options. And in your son's case, that might mean an apartment of his own, or an apartment with a live-in roommate, or a group home setting where 4 or 5 people live together with a live-in superintendent or whatever. You know, sometimes parents come together and do that, where they try to find a way to create a group home situation with government or on their own. It can be very expensive privately to do it, but again, depending on people's assessment levels and so forth. But I'm not sure where we're at in terms of where the federal CMHC, how the case is at on, they were promising a bold new housing strategies. There may be other people in the room that know this, but why I mention it, Helen, is that disability groups themselves have had an aha moment where they realize they need to take charge of this to the best of their capacities. That might not be the solution, it might not be even the biggest single solution, but they need to figure out, if we're sitting on land, we've got something to play with, we've got something to contribute. How do we interest people with the expertise in building and construction and development to help expedite the construction of housing? Again, not to create just segregated housing units for our children, but in a way that's mixed use so that there's inclusion that way. And we get municipalities on side to, again, help expedite zoning and planning so that you're not ensnared in red tape for 4 years and those issues. So again, I'm not sure what the situation is here in PEI on that. It's early days for us on the West Coast. And again, it's partly being exacerbated in British Columbia with our overheated housing market right now, which is really kind of a challenging problem. On the other hand, it makes the land some of the nonprofits are sitting on really valuable, but it's still challenging for getting builders and others interested in maybe some partnership. Conversations are starting, I can put it that way. So I think, again, we need to be more creative, but you're absolutely right. I mean, again, the right to have housing, the right to choose, the right to who to choose to live with, rather than wondering, is he just going to age in place at home with you? you know, and the burden. And then with your health or your future and your husband's, you know, those scenarios that you don't want to go to at this point, but you have to contemplate and say, you know, what's going to, so that I think is the greatest sense of anxiety a lot of people have, is the future. A safe place, a good place, a place in community, not a segregated place, and not in an inappropriate placement in a healthcare, very expensive nursing home, seniors home, or hospital, or long-term care beds where it's just, to me that's, someday I hope we'll look back and be shocked at how complacent Canadians were to allow 10,000 people to be in nursing homes right now and not talk about it, you know, not say that's a disgrace, that's a crisis. But we're not there. But so I think there's some hopeful sign. So maybe again, I don't know what the conversations are in PEI with some of the larger nonprofit organizations that have land, opportunities there for looking at creative construction of housing opportunities. If we're starting to look at, in 5 years, how do we commit to creating so many units, you know, and try to make that happen. That's a nice tangible goal at a project that I think you get some private sector support, governments and others kind of excited about. To me, that's a really nice tangible project and vision that could happen. So thanks again for your questions. They're tremendous. And thank you all for listening and being patient at this late hour. Thanks very much.
Good evening, folks. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Mark Spadell. I'm with Family and Human Services. I am the Director for Social Programs and responsible for the Disability Support Program. Michael, I certainly want to thank you for a rich discussion this evening. I think taking us through the landscape through disability over the last number of years and where we're at today and what a bold vision might look like for Canada is really helpful for us as we go through changes within our program. And so the work that you've been a part of with our team so far has really been very valuable, and I certainly want to appreciate and thank you for that. Thank folks this evening for coming here and those that are online, and for the discussion and questions from the floor. I think has really been enriching, and look forward to further conversations as we go through the changes within our program. Thanks and have a good night.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you.